Okay, in chapter 24, we're going to talk about the origin species, and this is where we're going to start bringing in a little bit of the things that we've talked about in chapters 22 and 23, kind of going over this whole idea of how speciation actually occurs. So, observe always that everything is the result of change, and get used to thinking that there is nothing nature loves so well as to change existing forms and to make new ones like them. So, I thought that was a pretty good quote to start the chapter with, or to start the topic with. So, just kind of keep in mind some of the things that we've talked about in class and in the earlier lectures about how speciation occurs when we're talking about this. So the essential idea here is that gene pools change over time. So in your folder somewhere, talk about or write down a paragraph about the TOK topic here, and we'll discuss it. Okay? Punctuated equilibrium was long considered an alternative theory of evolution and challenge to the long-established paradigm of Darwinian gradualism. How do paradigm shifts proceed in science, and what factors are involved in their success? Okay, so take a couple seconds, think about that, write down some things, and then we'll talk about it in class. Okay, so now gene pools, these consist of all of the genes within a particular population, all of the alleles present in this interbreeding population. Okay, so if you think about what we talked about way back in chapter 14 with the different blood types, you have A, B, and O blood type. And there's three different types of alleles that can kind of govern that. And if you remember, if making our Punnett squares, if we have IA, IA individual, say, with, someone who is IB, then all of these would be IA, IB. Okay, so they would have AB blood. If you had someone say that was A blood with the I allele and B blood with the I allele, then you could get, I keep doing that. You can get AB blood, okay, IA, IB. You can get B blood. You can get A blood. And you can get O blood. So there you have three different types of alleles, the IA, the IB, and the little I, and they give you the four different blood types. So those would make up the gene pool for the different blood types. Now, evolution requires that the allele frequencies change within a population through time. Okay? And speciation is this origin of new species, and this is kind of the focal point for evolutionary theory. You want to figure out where this divergence occurred and what gave rise to the new species, and hence increase the diversity of the entire population of organisms. There's more than one type. And we talked about in one of the earlier chapters here what microevolution was, and this is the idea that you've got this mutations that occur. You've got these different types of changes in the genome that result in these adaptations that arise within the gene pool and make some organisms more fit, less fit, whatever the case may be, and perhaps occupy a different niche in nature. And that gives rise, these microevolutionary changes give rise to macroevolution, which is the species level changes. This is what's going to give rise to the new species. These are the big changes. These are the types of things that come to represent the new organisms as a result of this divergence. Okay, so speciation due to divergence of these isolated populations can be gradual. That's the Darwinian kind of side of evolution that we're all very familiar with. And it can also be very abrupt, as in the case with punctuated equilibrium, which we'll talk about later. But there's a variety of gradual types of examples that we can discuss here. Okay, and there's the punctuated equilibrium that I spoke of there. Now, Ernst Mayr was one of the famous biologists of the 20th century, and what he came up with was this notion of the biological species concept. And what it basically says is that a species is a population or group of individuals whose members have the ability to interbreed with one another, and they produce viable, fertile offspring. Viable meaning living, fertile meaning they can produce more offspring, which themselves can also produce more offspring. And if you belong to the same species, you're unable to produce viable, fertile offspring with other populations of organisms. So this idea of viable, fertile offspring is kind of the distinguisher between the two different populations. Of course, you can have interbreeding occurring, as you'll see with a horse and donkey to make a mule, but those mules are sterile, so they're not fertile, in other words. Okay, so keep in mind the idea of viable, fertile offspring. organisms become reproductively isolated when they, lack the ability to interbreed with other populations. And there's different types of biological barriers. We have prezygotic and postzygotic. Pre, of course, meaning before, post meaning after. So these prezygotic barriers would be set up to hinder fertilization. Okay, they're going to impede mating. They're going to prevent an offspring from being formed. And postzygotic barriers, if the two organisms can produce a zygote, the postzygotic barriers might prevent fertilization, prevent speciation, in the sense that you have a very weak, a very fragile offspring that's not going to be able to survive to adulthood. It's not going to be fertile. It's not going to be living, perhaps. It's not going to be able to survive to reproductive age. All those types of things could be the postzygotic types of barriers. Okay? So now as far as prezygotic barriers to mating are concerned, these things, of course, are going to prevent fertilization largely from occurring. You're going to have habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical or morphological isolation, and then gametic isolation. So if we look at habitat isolation now, this occurs when two organisms that live perhaps in the same geographic area rarely encounter one another. So while they may be able to breed, just their general habitat within the geographical locale is going to prevent them from mating. So if we think about garter snakes, there's a whole variety of different types of garter snakes. Well, if one resides in the water or very close to the water, and the other one is a terrestrial type of an organism where it avoids the water, their habitats don't overlap, and therefore they're not going to really be in a position to ever mate with one another. So temporal isolation, if you recall, temporal means time. This occurs when there's differences in the breeding times. In different seasons, different years, a whole variety of different types of temporal isolation. And so if you consider the example here of the eastern and western spotted skunk, their geographical ranges, again, overlap just like with the garter snakes, but the eastern skunks mate in the late winter, whereas the western skunks mate in the late summer. So their breeding cycles have, for whatever reason, diverged from one another. And while they're very closely related, while you might be able to take the sperm from one organism and the egg from another and get a hybridization to occur, because these organisms breed at different times of the year, that's what's keeping them isolated from one another. Okay? So now the behavior of certain organisms, this is what can be involved in courtship types of rituals and so forth in terms of attracting a mate. And if these courtship rituals or these behaviors are different, they're different enough to set up a reproductive barrier where these organisms aren't going to be attracted to the other organisms, and you're going to again prevent a mating. So one of the examples would be the blue-footed boobies from the Galapagos Islands, and they have a courtship ritual where they dance and they show off their blue feet to prospective mates. These females then choose these males based on how blue their feet are, how good of a dance they can do, and other types of things. And there's other types of organisms, other forms of boobies in the Galapagos that aren't attracted to this sort of a thing. So again, this is a behavioral type of an isolation between the organisms. Okay. So now as far as morphological isolation occurs, this is kind of the form, and this is different types of anatomy, different appearances, and these things are then going to prevent a mating. So if you think about plants that have pollen that they're going to distribute into the environment, or that's going to get distributed from pollinators, there's certain types of colors that attract to certain types of pollinators, certain birds, certain insects, etc. And the different color and the ability to attract a certain type of organism is going to prevent cross-pollination in some cases. Okay, differences in flower shape, differences in flower design, etc. These types of things prevent breeding between the two organisms just because of the differences in shape and so forth. Okay. So far as as far as gametic isolation occurs, as far as the actual gametes themselves, this happens when the sperm of one species is incompatible with the eggs of another species. And there's many reasons why this doesn't occur. The sperm might not be able to survive in the reproductive tract of the female organism. The sperm, once it gets there, might not be able to penetrate the egg, etc. So if you think about certain types of organisms, aquatic organisms, plants, etc., as the gametes get released into the environment, it's a lot different than a typical animal would mate, as far as things that you think about, just that you're familiar with. These sea urchins, for instance, they're all along the seafloor, and there's many different species of these. And when they release their sperm to get to the eggs of a female, there might be very closely related sea urchins to one another. And as these things eventually arrive at the eggs of the sea urchin, they're only going to be able to penetrate the egg to which they're related, to which the same species that they belong to, and the other ones aren't going to be able to get there. So that's a way that they could be isolated. If you think about how certain frogs or toads or something, how they reproduce, how fish reproduce, there's lots and lots of sperm floating through the water, and the incompatibility of one species with another is what is represented kind of with this gametic isolation. Okay, so that takes care of the first part, part one here. We're going to pick up with part two, talking about the postzygotic barriers to reproduction. Okay, so write down any questions that you have, and we'll talk to you soon.